Good morning. Very glad to have everyone here as we continue in our study of the Gospel of Matthew. And this morning we'll be in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 10 and verse 32. Matthew chapter 10 and verse 32. Now, this verse is one that in isolation we're very familiar with, that we know very well. But we want to be sure and note the fact that it begins with therefore. And these words are not here accidentally. Therefore is a word that is a bridge that tells us that what follows is a logical conclusion of what came before. What Jesus says before is assuring his disciples that they are not going to be forgotten in the ordeals that they must endure, saying that not even a sparrow falls without the notice of the Lord, and do not be afraid, you are worth more than many sparrows. Therefore, everyone who acknowledged me before others, I will also acknowledge him before my Father in heaven. But whoever denies me before others, I will also deny him before my Father in heaven. Now, this is one that is probably somewhat intuitive, but it's worth noting that in context, Jesus here is specifically talking about those that have been sent out to do the preaching, to do the evangelizing in the area, and that he's cautioning them, warning them against the persecutions that they would face, that to deny him in the face of those persecutions would mean that he would be denied before the Father. To affirm him in the face of those persecutions would be to be affirmed before the Father. But he has here in verse 34, don't assume that I came to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. And this is another of those that we generally know by familiarity, but probably don't realize it comes right on the heels of Matthew 10, 32 and 33. Well, what place does this have in the words of assurance that he offers them in verses 31, 32, and 33? He says, don't be afraid. Affirm me before men, and I'll affirm you before my Father. Deny me before men, and I'll deny you before my Father. Don't assume that I came to bring peace on earth. Now, of course, there's something of a paradox here, and if you spend much time reading about the life of Jesus and the way that Jesus taught, you'll see that paradoxes were all throughout his teaching. Perhaps one of the best examples is the first shall be last and the last shall be first. Jesus loved employing paradoxes in the way that he in the way that he taught, forgive me, all you English teachers out there. But here he is using a paradox with reference to his purpose, right? So we know from the Gospel of Luke, whenever he is born, that the angels are singing that there would be peace on earth to men. But here he says, don't assume that I came to bring peace on the earth. So which is it? Which is right? And the reality is that both are true because there would be peace in terms of his work, his mission, his purpose, what would be accomplished on the earth, but there would be resistance to that ministry work and person. And so not by his actions, but by his presence. He is not a general. He's not advocating for disunity. He's not advocating for violence, but merely by his presence, there would be this type of discord. Think of in the plagues of Egypt, that at various times Moses writes that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And elsewhere, he says that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. Well, which is it? God did not reach into Pharaoh's heart and make his heart hard against his free will. He hardened his heart because he challenged Pharaoh's sense of self, his arrogance, his high view of his people and his role among his people. So in the same way, Jesus is bringing a sword because of the controversy that will surround him. He says in verse 35, I came to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. Not that that's saying much, tongue-in-cheek. And a man's enemies will be the members of his household. Now, we've seen this perhaps in practice in the book of Acts. Remember that Paul's nephew was the one that went and told Paul and told the commander of the plot that there was to lay in wait and kill Paul whenever he was in the custody of the Romans. I suggested to you that was probably because he was still in a position of influence within the Sanhedrin and was privy to that information because of his position. And you can imagine what the response of Paul's family would have been to Paul, would have made Thanksgivings very awkward, when it seems like most of Paul's family probably maintained their Jewish heritage, whereas Paul did not. But Jesus segues this into the one who loves a father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. The one who loves a son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever doesn't take up his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Anyone who finds his life will lose it, and anyone who loses his life because of me will find it. We find another of Jesus's paradoxes here. Now, the purpose of a paradox is not to say nothing in as many words as possible. It's to challenge and confront thinking. So I think of Bilbo's speech in The Lord of the Rings. It's one that's probably popular level enough that there's some familiarity with it. Right? He says, I know half of you half as well as I should like, and I like less than half of you half as well as you deserve. I love J.R. Tolkien's next sentence in the book. He says that there was silence because they were trying to figure out if they'd been insulted or not. Whenever you speak in paradoxes, it engages the mind, encourages thought and reflection. And this is just another way that Jesus is a master teacher, because he is not giving mantras for people to remember and recite. He is encouraging them to engage in thought, challenging them to grow in their minds. But what he says in these verses here are somewhat similar to things that we read elsewhere, that we read in chapter 10, verses 20 and 21, statements that are similar to what he makes in verses 34, 35, and 36. We know that elsewhere in the Gospel of Luke, he says to count the cost, take up your cross and follow me. Says that a person must be willing to deny himself, take up his cross and follow me. So it is my opinion that many of the things that we read Jesus teach, and we find this when people say, oh, well, in Matthew's gospel, he was teaching this at this point in his life. In Luke's gospel, he was teaching this at this point. People try and do the same thing with the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5 and the Sermon on the Plains in the Gospel of Luke to say they couldn't have been the same sermon, even though they purport to be. But it's my opinion that Jesus taught many of the same things at different times, different places. No good lesson is taught only one time, even if there are distinctions from one occasion to the other. And so we see Jesus here teaching similar things in different places. But But perhaps the most noteworthy for the first century audience that he was addressing is verse 38. Whoever doesn't take up his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Now, whenever we read that in the 21st century, what's the first thing that we are probably going to think of?
Think about before the crucifixion, Christ bore his own cross.
Right? Very literally, Jesus carried his own cross leading up to his crucifixion. So whenever we see whoever doesn't take up his cross and follow me is not worthy of me, we think of it in terms of Jesus's crucifixion. It's very natural. Paul wrote to the Corinthians that he purposed to know nothing among them except Christ and him crucified. So obviously, this is a very pivotal moment for us, our faith, our understanding, and knowing what the role and work and person of Jesus was. But is that what his disciples would have thought hearing this in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 38? No. Why not? It hadn't happened yet, right? He's not been crucified. So we want to, take off our 21st century glasses, put on our first century glasses, and try and read this as one of these first century Jews would have read it. So what are they going to think whenever Jesus says, deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me? What is the cross to a first century Jew?
Whatever the trials are in their life, because to them, the cross was for criminals.
Right? Yeah. It's a means of, yeah. It has no religious context as we think of it. And it's a means of execution within the judicial system. And it's somewhat more specific than that. That's entirely correct. But there's another detail that we can add to it. Who's going to be executed by means of the cross? What's that? Criminals, okay? What kind of criminals? Are Romans going to be crucified? No, the Romans, except for under very extreme circumstances, it was illegal for a Roman citizen to be executed by the cross. So what kind of criminals are to be executed on the cross? What was the charge that was brought against Jesus in Luke 22 and 23 to Pilate? What was the justification the Jews used? He was trying to be king, right? So the people that are crucified aren't just your regular, normal criminals. They are a lot of times political opponents, political criminals. So the cross is not just the means of execution, but it is an explicit reference to the influence of Rome among the Hebrews in Judea, and it is the means by which they are putting to death the Jews that would be against Roman rule in Judea. Now, why would that maybe be a little curious for people that are following and listening to what Jesus is teaching and telling them? Well, that's what they're hoping, right? They're wanting. What's their idea of Jesus, and if not Jesus specifically, of the Messiah, the Christ, the Anointed One that they're hoping for?
Take over the world.
Yeah. Overthrow Rome, become a preeminent world power once again, as they were under David and Solomon. And Jesus is, much rather than saying to throw off the yoke of Roman slavery, says, take up your cross and follow me. Wear this emblem of shame among the Romans to carry the burden of this political execution. So he's really overturning what their expectations are here. And whenever, again, with paradoxes, so he's sending his disciples out and is really putting them at the mercy of the people, right? Verse 17, beware of them because they will hand you over to local courts, flog you in the synagogues. You will even be brought before governors and kings because of me to bear witness to them and to the Gentiles. And tells them going back to the beginning in verse 5, to not take a traveling bag for the road, an extra shirt, sandals, or a staff in verse 10, that they're dependent on the people. So Jesus is not here setting up a revolution against Rome. He is preparing people to reach people, and that cannot possibly be brought to a finer point than what he says in verse 38. So whenever he says in verse 39, anyone who finds his life will lose it, and anyone who loses his life because of me will find it. We a lot of times talk about this verse in a very metaphorical way, and I think that the principle certainly applies. Not everyone is given the opportunity to become a martyr for Christ, not even in the first, second, and third centuries when the persecution of the church was so much more prevalent. But he's speaking to people that need to be preparing themselves to face even violent persecution, and uses the cross as an emblem of this possible violent persecution. And so whenever he says that anyone who loses his life because of me will find it, as I said, I think the principle applies in a metaphorical way, but I think that Jesus means this in a very literal way, that he is cautioning his disciples that they would face persecution for him up to and including death and execution as political prisoners. Now, this really is, aside from just the immediate context here, what I think is a strong evidence in favor of the authenticity of the New Testament scriptures. So imagine that we all colluded here this morning. And I said, listen, y'all, this is going to be great. Tell everyone that you meet that you saw me touch this podium and it turned into solid gold. No matter what, affirm that this happened, right? And then you go and you do it and you're talking to people and somebody out there says, did you really see that happen? Keith, did Jason really touch that podium and it really turned to gold? There's not really much of a consequence for you to say, yeah, except maybe there might even be a bit of a motivation to, if someone's going to really accept it, believe it, because then they're not just going to be impressed with me, but they're going to be impressed that you did what? That you witnessed it, that you were there for it. Now, what if, rather than saying, did you really see it? If somebody says, I'm gonna beat you if you don't tell me the truth. What if somebody says, I'm going to kill you if you don't tell the truth? So the reason why this affirms the authenticity of the New Testament is because what motivation is there for first century disciples to lie about the things that they witnessed? And some people say, oh, well, they didn't want to get caught in the lie. And to believe that, we have to accept that they didn't want to get caught in the lie, so much so that they were willing to die for the lie. And people say, oh, well, they were influential people. They did it for prosperity. They did it for for attention and praise among people. But was that what the first century disciples experienced? Were they praised? Were they heralded? Were they widely accepted? What happened to Paul on multiple occasions whenever he was on his missionary journeys? He was driven out of cities. He was stoned and left for dead. So I think that this is really at the heart of what Jesus is saying here, all the way back to the beginning when he is sending out the 12 in Matthew, the 70 in Luke, is that there's going to be opposition, even violent opposition, to what they are teaching and preaching, but assuring them to hold fast to it. And even though this is not something that most people in the world today will have firsthand experience with, it is something that we can understand and appreciate, at least in principle. All right. Any questions, comments, anything anyone has? Carol?
I don't want to get you going off chasing rabbits, but
That's fine by me.
I had a question about the thieves on the cross.
Uh-huh.
And they were crucified as well.
Right.
The only thing we know about them is that they were thieves. So, is it likely that they were Jews?
Almost certainly. If not Jews, they were people that were traveling in the area, and or not necessarily traveling, but transplanted. If not Jews, they were non-Romans that were there in and around Jerusalem. But the way that we usually think of them as thieves is probably not entirely accurate. The word would be more accurately translated as robbers. And we understand there's a difference between something being stolen and someone being robbed, right? That robbery necessarily has a use of force in mind. And because they were robbers that were being executed by Rome, it was probably not against Jews that they'd committed their robbery. So these were probably either Jews or in Judea, or non-Romans that lived in and around Judea and Jerusalem that had robbed Romans. And because they had robbed Romans, they fall under this umbrella of a political offense because they struck out against Rome. Okay, so very good question, and a very small rabbit, if one at all. So, okay, yeah.
In light of verse 38, and the context of Jesus commissioning the 12 in this context, there's no biblical record of it, but tradition holds that some of them were crucified, right? That literally put on a cross.
Right, yeah. Yep. Peter perhaps being the most famous example, by tradition, refusing to be crucified right side up in the fashion of the Lord and stuff. And whether they were literally crucified or not, we know that at the very least, Peter died a martyr's death because Jesus tells him that's what's going to happen in John 21, at the close of the Gospel of John. John telling us that he told him this to tell him by what kind of death he would glorify the Lord. But yeah, so there was a very literal meaning of this for the people that he was delivering it to, because they were going to be asked to give up their life. And while we're on the topic of Peter, Dan Barker, a noted skeptic, I remember reading his book one time, and he was making the case that it's not an ad hominem argument to say that Peter is a liar because the Bible records him lying. But on the topic I was talking of a few moments ago, someone would have to be so committed to the lie that they'd be willing to die for it. Let's think about that charge that Peter's a liar, referring, of course, to his 3 denials of Jesus. Why was he denying Jesus on the night of his arrest and trial? To save his own skin, right? Because he was afraid for his life. So then what does that tell us? That man, years later, is willing to affirm Jesus to the point of and including death. If he was willing to lie to save his skin before, is he going to lie later with the cost being his life? So it tells us at the very least that Peter did what of his statements, of his affirmations? At the very least, he believed them to be true, right? And he makes some very bold claims about what he witnessed firsthand. All right. Any other questions, comments? Rabbits, great or small? Okay. Rick?
Up and down a short rabbit trail, he was talking about Peter in John chapter 21, and it really amazed me. Jesus says, when you grow old, you'll stretch out your hand and someone else will bring you where you do not wish to go.
Uh-huh.
Now this, he says, signifying what kind of death he would glorify God. It just occurred to me that I have a hard enough time glorifying God in my life. He was even going to glorify God in his death.
Right. Yeah. And yeah.
Easy now, easy later. And that's not the way to glorify God.
And we know what his mindset was towards it because of Acts 4 and 5. I think it's in Acts 5 specifically, but somebody would have to double check me on it. It could also be in Acts 4 because he and John are imprisoned and everything for the cause of Christ in both. But I think it's in Acts 5 that they're beaten and sent out being instructed to no longer preach in the name of Jesus. And Peter and John go away rejoicing that they were considered worthy to suffer shame for his name. And the shame that they endured was being beaten by their kinsmen in front of witnesses, most likely, right? And the shame that we have to endure is, he's so weird, right? And we find one to be more compelling than the other. But that is a rabbit that we would go descending down. All right. Any other questions, comments, anything anyone has? I think I emphasized this recently, but it's always worth noting, right? Whenever I say anything at all, I don't mean it has to be directly or indirectly related to what we're talking about. If you have a question, if you were reading something this week and you thought, I really want to understand that better, please feel free to raise it. I don't have any lesson plan that I have to hold to. I'm going to be here from 10 to 11 regardless every first day of the week. So if there's something fruitful, beneficial, we want to use every opportunity we have to address it and grow. If not, though, verse 40, Jesus says, the one who welcomes you welcomes me, and the one who welcomes me welcomes him who sent me. Now, this is a logical statement that Jesus makes here, right? So if you're not familiar with it, if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C is the logical sentence there. And he says, the one who welcomes you welcomes me. The one who welcomes me welcomes him who sent me. Anyone who welcomes a prophet because he is a prophet will receive a prophet's reward. And anyone who welcomes a righteous person because he's righteous will receive a righteous person's reward. And whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones because he is a disciple, truly I tell you, he will never lose his reward. Now, these little ones that he says there in verse 42, we know Matthew 10:42, again, isolated from the context in which we find it. So usually if we read Matthew 10:42, that he gives a cold cup of water to one of these little ones, we're more inclined to think of children, little ones literally, but who are the ones that he's talking about here in Matthew 10:42? He's not talking about children. He's talking about who? His disciples, the ones that he's sending out to go and face persecution and death. And but I think that we have here something of a contrast to the very intimidating image that he paints in verses 32 through 39. Because there are going to be those that deny Jesus. There are going to be those that persecute his followers because of what they're teaching and saying and doing. There's going to be discord that arises within families. That's one side. But on the other side, what's also going to happen? There's not just going to be the bad. There's a reward for those that endure. And among the people, there's also going to be those that receive them well. I couldn't help but think of this verse a few weeks ago when we were last giving away food from our food drive in June, that I was standing up by the road, waving a sign at people, come on in. And there was a UPS driver that had gone down and made a delivery down here, and came up and stopped at the stop sign, jumped out and handed me a bottle of water. I felt bad because I had a bottle of water already, but I was so taken aback at the gesture that I was just like, oh, thank you. And then by the time I kind of realized what was going on, he was already in the truck and off on his way. Now, he knew absolutely nothing about me. He didn't know even what my name was, and yet, it was a hot day, and he wanted to make sure that I was well hydrated and stopped to give me a cup of water. When we had chapel at Freed Hardeman, there was a one day. This was all a setup, but one of our teachers was starting, and we went through the reading and the prayer and stuff like that. And then this man walks in with long hair and dirty clothes. And I don't remember who was at the podium when it started, but the guy was actually one of our teachers, Glenn Hinton. And he came up to the stage and, took off the wig and said that he, for the previous week, waited around campus to see how people would respond to him, and talked about people that had come up and spoken with him and people that ignored him. And he said that there was one student, and he remembered her name, I don't, these years later, and said that she brought him an apple and a bottle of water. And he still had the apple, and he said he wanted to return it to her, but he drank the bottle of water because it was hot that day. He, at the time, now, I was a full-grown adult. I was 19, 20 years old. Nobody could tell me anything. It's only now, looking back, that I realize how foolish I was then. I'm sure in another 20 years, I'll think the same thing about whenever I was 37. He said, that this young girl brought him an apple and a bottle of water, and he wept. And that's, whenever I read Matthew 10:42, that always stays in my mind. But we don't have to be reminded of the bad. We don't have to be reminded of the evil in the world. All of us know, without any thought, that there's a lot of bad stuff going on right now. And kind of the irony is that depending on who you ask, depends on what the bad stuff is exactly. But everybody is in agreement that there's bad stuff going on. And whoever it is, nobody has to be reminded. If you hurt your leg, if you sprain your ankle, if you've got a rock in your shoe, nobody has to remind you that there's that bad stuff that is happening to you. But sometimes we do need to be reminded that in the midst of everything, that there are people that are willing to give, a country guy like me a bottle of water on a hot day just because I'm there. There's good that goes on. There are people that are willing to receive us. And even if 90% of people want absolutely nothing to do with what we have going on here, it's worth not losing heart because of the 1 in 10 that would receive us. But I should digress, or perhaps regress. Okay, I don't really want to get started in Matthew chapter 11 with just a few minutes left here at the end. Did anyone have any closing remarks, questions, comments, anything at all as we close out Matthew chapter 10 here? All right, well, I told you that I was getting good at those bells, and now this time, not even the second bell was able to come for me. So remember that the next time I'm going over, which I'm sure won't take long. All right. Well, thank you all so much for your attention, your questions, your participation. And we'll pick up next week in Matthew chapter 11 and verse 1.